Thank you very much. Often when we have public engagements, then there's a sort of pre-prepared set of slides that we bring together in a talk. This one isn't pre-prepared insofar as the situation that we are facing is one that is current within the UK government and in conversation between myself and others and the government office. So I wanted to really, rather than solicit to you my opinion, but to seek your opinions. And I suspect we will have the full spectrum in the room. There will be those of you who think there's no problem with this, and that's absolutely fine because that is your opinion. There will be those who find what I'm going to say incredibly offensive, and equally that is okay because it's your opinion. But there will also be a number of people who sit in that quite wide grey area that says, I don't know if I'm okay with this. So I've placed a warning up there because some of the things that I'm going to show and some of the things I'm going to talk about may be quite challenging. And if at any point you feel uncomfortable, then please, the most important thing that you can do is to just stand up and leave. There is no offence in this, but it is a subject that is very challenging, and it's one that is immediate and imminent. Now, you might be thinking, I've got a skull in my attic, and look at the price tag. I could sell that for £1,700. Where do I do that? What I hope by the end of this is that maybe there'll be a few other questions you might add in there before you go rushing to put some more money in your bank. Is it okay to buy a human skull for £1,700? Is it okay to buy the skeletal remains of a fetus when somebody will pay you £5,500 for it? Is it okay if that fetus in its development had an abnormality? Because to sell that, there is really no limit on the price. And what price human remains? If at the end of it all, how comfortable would you be if you knew who the human remains belonged to? If they were my father, I would have serious objection to them being sold. If they were my grandmother, I would have serious objection. If there were anyone within my lineage, within my ancestry, I would feel offended. So what right do I have to feel offended when it's my family, when at the same time the remains that I don't know who they are were somebody else's family? And the question is, did they give consent for their body parts to have a price placed on them? And 99.9% of those, I would expect, if not the full 100, there is no consent from the person who has allowed their remains to be put on the market and to be sold. And the whole purpose of the whole thing is about supply and demand. If there is somebody who demands something, somebody somewhere will find the supply to meet that demand. If the demand is high and the supply is low, then the price will be high. And it'll be conversely the other way around. If the demand is low and the supply is high, then the price will drop and supply will eventually fall away. So in terms of just basic economics, wherever we have a commodity to sell, it can only be sold when there is somebody who is prepared to buy it. And I would ask in this day and age why people would choose to buy human remains, and we'll come to that. But let's look just for a moment as if this was the skeleton. And the skeleton, you know, we're quite used to the skeleton because it's appeared in so many cartoons and every single Halloween that we have. There's something funny about them. There's something a little bit scary. They're old and they're dry and they're dusty. And they don't really mean a person. To some individuals, they don't. But in my job is to try to give back the identity to skeletal remains. Now, law requires for me that if at the end of the day the person has been dead within the last 70 years, then it becomes a matter for forensic investigation, because there is still a possibility that if this is a homicide, then somebody may be held to account. If at the end of the day you died more than 70 years ago, the chances of bringing someone to justice is unlikely, and what will happen is that you become an archaeological specimen 70 years from the date of your death. And that's a really arbitrary set of dates, and one that is convenient in a legal sense, but has no representation in a moral sense. So take this skeleton, which was placed for sale in an auction house. And to some individuals, this is just a collection of dry, old bones that don't belong to anybody and nobody knows who they are. But let me tell you what I see here. What I see here is the representation of at least 4 individuals. One of those individuals is a male, and he is a male of between the ages of 35 and 45, and most likely is of Indian origin. Another individual in there is also male, most likely to be male, and the age of their death is somewhere between 20 and 30 years. The minute we start to be able to put a biological identity to an individual, they stop becoming a pile of old, dry bones. And let me tell you about an experiment I did. In Inverness's Technical College, they had a skeleton in the biology closet, literally. And so they brought the skeleton out. And I spent the day talking to those young people, and we identified that the skeleton was male. We identified it came from an individual who was probably between about 18 and 25 years of age. An individual who had quite severe developmental anomalies. An individual who came with Indian origin. And an individual whose face we were able to reconstruct. Those young people who could now see the possible face of the individual, could relate to the individual because of their age, their background, and their disability, were no longer content for that skeleton to go back into the science cupboard. But they had a quandary. What do we now do with it? And that's the problem that we face. If you're somebody who, of a certain age, own your own teaching skeleton because it was perfectly normal for it to be bought during the turn of the century, last century, right up until about the 1980s, then it's amazing the number of skeletons that sit in wooden boxes in attics that nobody quite knows what to do with, and that is a problem. The next slide is a little bit more challenging, so just so I will warn you. We might be quite comfortable in the fact that human bones can be sold, but why are we not comfortable about organs being sold? Because when we think about organs, we think about transplantation, we think about illegality. But if these were organs coming out of somebody who's deceased and you want to own their brain or their kidney or their eye or their heart or their liver, there's actually nothing that stops you from being able to have those. Why you would want them, I don't know, but there would be nothing to stop you. It would be questionable. But what's really interesting is if you place some skill associated with these, then they become an object of art. And that object of art now has a property. It belongs to you, and you can legitimately sell it. And that's what we see here. So these are those remains that we saw, now embalmed, so in formaldehyde most likely, sitting in a jar with a label. Somebody has placed skill on them. And therefore, if somebody was to steal them, they can be prosecuted. And we have a precedence for that within our legal system, where some remains were removed from an anatomy department. They were then embalmed, they were sold, and the individual who did that was prosecuted. So at the end of the day, this is legal. And you have to question that addition of skill. How important is that? Common law states that body parts do not constitute property, and that sits under Section 4 of the Theft Act of 1968. You cannot own a human body unless you apply some skill to it. And then when you own it, you can legitimately sell it. The area before that is very grey, because you cannot own a body or a body part until you impart some skill on it. If you were to go and grave rob, I'm not suggesting you would, but if you were to go and grave rob, then that is desecrating a grave. That is an offence, and you can be prosecuted for that. But you cannot be prosecuted for the theft of the body. If the body is wrapped in a shroud, or if the body is wearing a ring, you can be prosecuted for the theft of those, because those are items and objects that belonged to somebody. But a body belongs to nobody. And so there is a very grey area within our legal system as to what we can legally do and what we cannot. I want to go back in time, because no matter how much time passes, as an anatomist, everybody will take you back to the times of grave robbing. And when we were looking at grave robbing in these times, in the 1800s, if you ask who was the supply for, who was the demand from, who was buying with the medical schools, the anatomy departments? Because during the 1800s, UK was at war in Europe, and we needed more doctors. So we needed more medics. So we needed to be able to teach them. And we had a really almost exponential rise in anatomy schools. And those anatomy schools could garner more funds if actually you were able to dissect a body. So what was happening is that the anatomy schools were paying people to rob the graves. You would watch who had died in a family. You would watch where they were buried. And that night you would go in and you would dig the body up. There was desecration of the grave, but there was no theft in the body. And they would strip the body. So they'd leave behind the shroud. They'd leave behind everything else, because they knew they couldn't be prosecuted for the stealing of a body. These resurrectionists were very challenging for the government of the time, because there was a real hue and cry about the sacred nature of death and leaving those who die in peace, because we say rest in peace. And if we say it, we should mean it. I then take you to the most notorious of those, which were Burke and Hare. And it was so prevalent at the time in the psyche of the country that when somebody writes a little ditty about it, then you know that everybody's aware. Up the close and down the stair, Button Ben wi' Burke and Hare. Burke's the butcher, Hare's the thief, Knock's the boy who buys the beef. They weren't prosecuted for being resurrectionists. They were prosecuted for being murderers. They decided to skip the bit in the middle. And they would identify from Knox what kind of a body they would like. Would they like some more women? Would they like some pregnant women? Children were bought by the inch, depending on how tall they were. And so they would go straight to the individual, they would murder them, and then they would sell those bodies. That is something that we can sign, isn't it? Back to the 1800s. But you know, history has a habit, not necessarily of repeating itself, but of humming a very familiar tune. And in the early 2000s, and many of you may remember Alistair Cook, who did Postcards from America, what we found is that as we looked at samples that were being used for transplantation, in DNA terms, we could relate them back to his corpse. And what had happened was, in America, there were these funeral directors where the body would go in the front, but it would never come out the back. And the body would be stripped down as if you were almost stripping a car down to its parts. And its parts were being sold for transplantation within the medical professions. And we had our own somewhat similar scandals in the UK. We had the Alder Hey scandal, where children's organs were being removed without parents' knowledge or consent for study, for research, by pathologists, not by anatomists, but by pathologists. And similarly, in the Bristol heart scandal, we had very similar things. We had a research project that pathologists were looking at, that medics were looking at, and they needed the hearts to be able to do it. And they would remove the heart from a baby for the purposes of research. Is that okay? Maybe it is for you. it isn't for me. And it wasn't because it raised a hue and cry. And there is a real sort of pattern here that the minute that public opinion starts to raise its voice, government will often listen, especially when it's something that is so emotive as this. The situation with Burke and Hare resulted in something called the Anatomy Act. And the Anatomy Act that you can see here in the 1800s, that was the first one. And the whole purpose of that was to make bodies available for dissection legally, so that we didn't have to have the resurrectionists. But because we didn't have enough bodies, then what ended up happening was that people who were in prisons and poorhouses, if their bodies were not collected, then they were passed over to the anatomy department. And the public said, before, the only people who could be hanged and given to the anatomists were murderers. Now this is the same fate for the poor, and that was unacceptable. And we changed the Anatomy Act to something called the Human Tissues Act in 2004. And in that was as a result of Alder Hey and the Bristol heart scandal. What it says within the Human Tissues Act, and there's a Human Tissues Act in England and Wales, and there's a separate one in Scotland. If death has occurred within the last 100 years, why 100 years? It's just a convenient number. Then the remit of the Human Tissue Act 2004, then these remains fall within it. So if you died 100 years ago or less, then you come under the remit of the Anatomy Act. If you died 101 years ago, then you don't. Just as simple as that. And what the Anatomy Act says is that those individuals, you cannot sell, it is illegal to sell human organs. Unfortunately, whoever put the Anatomy Act together didn't consider that the human skeleton is an organ. And it is an organ because it's something that grows, it's something that becomes deceased, it's something that if you cut it, it hurts. If you cut it, it bleeds, it can heal. It is living tissue. Because we think of skeletons as being something dead and dry and dusty. But in reality, there are living tissues and an organ system just the same as any other part of our body. That tells me that those individuals who died before 1925, in the lifetime of my grandparents, are not governed by the Human Tissues Authority. So you can sell anything associated with them. But if it's been in the last 100 years, well, you know, we don't really say very much about the skeleton, but we do say a lot about transplantation. And that transplantation is usually considered to be associated with organs, but not the skeleton. So why do we care? Because graves are being robbed, even today. 21 ancient skulls robbed from an ossuary in Kent. Why? If each skull can raise £1,500 or more, I think that probably answers your question. So there's an increase in the supply. And we see it in the press. We see grave robbing. Today, between 2022 and 2025, these cases alone, and the one on the bottom where my dear friend Lord Paul Boateng is shown, was a case of human skeletons that were placed for auction in Oxfordshire. And the people who realised that the auction was going ahead was the Pitt Rivers Museum. And the Pitt Rivers Museum is way ahead of many other museums in the country in terms of their way of thinking about how we interact with the human remains that we have. If you can buy a skull for £1,500, there are those who will consider robbing graves. Now that's one source of human remains, but I want to take you back in history to where there's actually a much bigger problem in terms of the human remains that are out there on the market. And I want to take you back to Calcutta in particular, but almost any part of India during the time when the British colonial period was at its height. During that time, there was a huge demand from the medical schools in the UK, across Europe, and in America for the purchase of human remains. And those human remains were skeletons. And it was for teaching purposes, which sounds very laudable, and I'm one of those teachers. But we are buying human remains by which to teach our students. What they did was that they would pay people on the ground to go out and to rob the graves. And the bodies were taken to the companies and they were stripped down, and the rest of the body wasn't of any interest to them. So that would have just been got rid of, whatever was left of body, whether it be hair or skin or organs that were decomposing. They weren't relevant because the demand was for teaching skeletons. So the bones were collected, those bones were bleached because as a commodity we wanted them to look clean, and they would be sold. Where we found a really big increase in the number of skeletons being used was following the Bengal famine, where millions of people lost their lives. And suddenly we had a supply that almost, we could meet any level of the demand. Where those skeletons came from was laundered out of our conscience. When we bought them, as we did in that time, from medical supply companies, nobody thought, did that individual give consent for my body to be brought from its grave out of piece, stripped down into its parts, bleached, and then sold for a commercial company across the world? Those skeletons now end up in our attics, in our anatomy departments, because in 1985, the industry collapsed in India. A group of individuals were arrested because they were found guilty of exporting over 1,500 child skeletons. When you've got enough adult skeletons, then you start to think, well, what else do I need to tell you what? I need child skeletons. And so these children, their remains were being exhumed. But we also know that children go missing on the streets of India at that time. And there's a suspicion that we're back to the days of Burke and Hare. History hums a familiar tune. It is estimated that between 1947 and 1985, 2.4 million skeletons and skulls were exported across the world. But that's just from 1947. And if you imagine there was a lot more time before that, you now get a concept of just how many million skeletons are out there. And as our opinions change, and as our morals and our ethics change, there is a problem that says, what do you do with them? What do you do with these remains? You can't bury them in a cemetery because these individuals may not have been Christian. You don't know. You might be doing something dreadful to them if they believed in a purgatory, and that would be their belief. Do you cremate them? Why would you do that? That, again, may be something that somebody objects to. So what tends to happen is that they collect dust in the cupboards and in the vaults of anatomy departments. But there is a market. Museums won't take them. Without provenance, museums will not take these skeletons, quite rightly. Anatomy departments are unwilling to because they don't know the provenance. Does it fit within the Anatomy Act? How do they know that they've died more than 100 years ago? They don't. And they don't want to fall foul of what is the government law. But there are people who want to buy them, artists, and there's a sort of macabre, curio sort of society who thinks how cool it would be to own a bit of a human. There's about 100 vertebral columns hanging here, waiting to be sold. And there's some quite growing strength of feeling against this. And somebody who has said there is no ethical way to buy and sell human remains because there's a clear link between the legacy of this and racism, scientific racism, and colonialism. So let me take you back to this. This is another auction that went ahead, but one that we were not able to stop, because what we do is the minute we see these for auction, we contact the auction house and say, I really don't think this fits within the policies associated with what you're able to sell. And most auction houses will take them down and won't sell them. But this one sold. This half skeleton sold, and it's sold for £650. Who's buying them? There's a really buoyant market for the sale of human remains. And, places like Etsy and eBay, they have all said, actually, we're not going to allow the sale of human skeletal remains. And Facebook and Instagram, who said they will do the same, haven't yet, but they will do. Who's buying them? Well, there's a real rise in the revival of the occult, the witchcraft, and the Gothic movements amongst millennials, those who are into that sort of dark area of art and think how incredible it would be to own a human body? What if it was your mother? Are you happy for them to own your mother? Are you happy for them to own you? And this is what a buyer and a seller of remains said. I'm also an obsessive collector of antique oddities. Human remains are not antique oddities. I like books on the esoteric and disturbing medical instruments, but what I really like are human bones, especially ones that aren't quite perfect. A rehealed, once broken human tibia, I'm listening. An abnormal human skull, I'm all ears, and probably about to pay for your dinner, so you'll keep talking. When you hear that sort of language, it makes me feel uncomfortable. What are they selling and what are they buying? They're selling human skulls. You can buy a human tooth for £7.50. You can buy a human vertebral column for £235, and look, it's sold out. You can buy a collection of vertebrae which have no relevance to any single individual and are literally just a mixture for £195, and it's sold out. Museums are not buying this. Anatomy departments are not buying this. This isn't about education. This is about people buying it for collections or buying it for other reasons such as occult or Gothic interest. And in this one, you can see really quite exorbitant fees. £2,500 for a trepanation, which is a hole that's being placed in a skull. And somehow the thing on this slide that worries me the most is the fact that you can buy a gift card. Who do you buy this for as a gift? Look at these. A fetal skull. So a baby not yet born out of its mother, which is the one that's sitting on the book. £2,750. A human child skull. £3,950. And a child skull with dwarfism, trust me, that isn't a child skull with dwarfism, but it's how it's being sold, £3,450. That's telling you about the rarity, and that's telling you what people are prepared to pay. But if you break them down, you can actually make more out of it. So for every time you put a little tooth into a piece of jewellery, you can sell the earrings for £195. If you drill down into the femur, into the thigh bone, and you create these bone spikes, you can sell the earrings for £195. Did the person who owned that femur give permission for their body to be changed into jewellery for somebody else to wear and for somebody to buy? And a square inch of human leather will cost you £150. Silver lock skull cap pendant with a nice little skull suture running through it, £245. A finger pendant. Why do you want a finger? Somebody else's finger as a piece of jewellery, £145. And a lucky human toe, not lucky for the individual, £150. And tell me what this says to you. Those are human left lower limb, but look at the way it's displayed. It's funny. It's an animal holding it. It's not funny. These are human remains. And the individual who sells these says, in the past, I run competitions as well as auctioning items off to raise money for local independent hedgehog charities. I do my best to recycle the dead to help the living. Well, help living hedgehogs, perhaps, but not others. And I have to ask whether that's correct. So what does the law say? The only law that we have on the statute books is the Human Tissue Act of 2004, but it provides us no help whatsoever about the disposal of these skeletal remains. And most of them, the vast majority of them, were purchased for anatomical instruction, and the vast majority of them are of an Indian origin. We have a precedent in law, and a precedent that says we ban the sale of ivory, we ban the sale of birds' nests, we ban the sale of birds' eggs. But ironically, we don't ban the sale of human remains unless it's for transplantation. So I put the question to you, are we respecting the deceased? Should there be a limit placed on, if you're more than 100 years old, then that's okay? Well, more than 100 years old takes me into family members that I remember. And even if I didn't, I would care about it, whether it was somebody else's family, as much as I would care about it as if it was mine. Does it matter where they came from? Yes, I think it really does matter where they came from. If individuals give consent for their thigh bones to be created into jewellery, that's absolutely fine by me. I have no problem with that at all, if that's what you want to happen to your remains. But if you haven't given that permission, then one has to question whether anybody else has the right to do that to you. And I take you back to the whole item of respect, dignity, decency, responsibility, and respect that we expect to give to those who are living. And certainly in my job, it is mine to do it to the dead as well. Is this respectful? This is a real skull, stained so it looks as if it's bronzed, and it's got fitted brass nails that come up through the mandible, down through the maxilla, and you can see them coming up at the top. It's been made into a table lamp. Are you content for somebody you know and somebody you loved to be made into a table lamp? The next one is very distressing, and I do apologize for it, but this is the reality of what we're dealing with. Back at my studio, I eventually found 2 dehydrated fetuses at the bottom of a jar. As soon as I recognized them, I put them in a new jar, filled them with a specially prepared rehydrating liquid. The fetuses stayed in that liquid for about 2 weeks before I rinsed them off and freeze-dried them. Then I sprayed them with gold paint and fashioned them into a pair of earrings. Not a body part, but fetuses, human fetuses. The artwork was seized by the police because there was a real outcry from the public, and the gallery owner was also formally charged. The artist was fined £500, and the gallery owner was fined £300 for what I consider to be the desecration, not of a body part, but of an entire person who certainly never gave their consent for this to happen. And did their mother know who actually aborted these fetuses, whether intentionally or otherwise, we don't know, for them to be turned into a pair of earrings? I suspect not. We secured a short debate, Lord Boateng and I, in March of this year in the House of Lords. And Baroness Twycross has been incredibly supportive of the stance that we have. And I'm going to read her words. I begin by echoing the Deputy Prime Minister who, speaking in the other place, which is the House of Commons last year, declared the sale of human body parts, regardless of their age and origin, to be abhorrent. I am personally appalled by any disrespectful treatment of human remains and agree wholeheartedly with the Deputy Prime Minister's view. As my noble friend said, this issue is about basic human decency. Like I had said, I genuinely cannot see how we have more stringent law around the sale of ivory. And the briefing that I got mentioned birds' nests and birds' eggs than around human remains. It feels completely out of step with where we should be as a society. Nothing happened after that, and then we had an opportunity to add a supplementary question in Minister's Question Time. And the answer when I asked what has happened since we last met was that we are now in a position to set up a cross-Whitehall meeting of relevant ministers and policy officials to discuss a range of options, including legislative change, to prohibit the abhorrent sale of human remains, and from Lord Boateng's side, to further protect the dignity of those remains belonging to Indigenous peoples. Because one of the items, or several of the items that were being sold in that Oxfordshire auction were shrunken heads, shrunken human heads, which have, since Victorian times, captured a huge sale value. We should not be selling cultural artefacts from other societies. And we should certainly, in my opinion, not be selling human remains to those who are using it for the occult, for macabre reasons, for gothic reasons, because it feels cool, or because they can put £1,000 in their bank. This is a big problem because out there we have thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of skeletons in the UK alone that have come from India, that have been robbed from graves, stripped and sold. I don't know where this is going to go, because this is the point where we're at right now with the government. And I hope that you'll keep an eye on it as it progresses. I think it will be a lot more challenging for Lord Boateng to get what he requires, because those cultural artefacts have really big objections to their return in certain museums. But I think a legislative change that adds to the Human Tissue Act, that says the sale of all human parts should be made illegal. If we can do that for birds' nests, and we can do it for birds' eggs, why can't we do it for human remains? So I want to thank you for listening to this. I apologise if it is a challenging subject, but I think it's a really important one, and I think it's one where many of us will know where there are still skeletons in a closet. And sometimes it's in a GP surgery. Sometimes we've had skeletons come in before from St. John's Ambulance, from schools, science departments, from all sorts of places, and granddad's teaching skeleton or grandma's teaching skeleton that was in the attic. People just don't know what to do with them. If you have them, my advice would be just hold on to them for a little bit longer, because my hope is that the law will catch up with where we need to be, and we'll be in a position, hopefully, to be able to advise you as to what will be an appropriate way to dispose of these remains in the future, in a manner that is appropriate for a society that cares as much for its living as it does for its dead. Thank you very much.